Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to talk about Zandalari Hero Charm versus the Prayer Beads. Now, this is kind of an interesting topic. It doesn't really have much to do with Phase 5, which is kind of the new thing, but, I don't see it talked about a lot, and somebody asked me a question in the comments, and I figured it was worth it. I broke it down for them in the comments, but I feel like it was worth it to just do a video on this. Because a lot of people probably don't realize, which trinket is actually better, and then how good Prayer Beads is, and kind of like the advantages and disadvantages. So I'm just going to do a quick video here. The math is really simple. It's more about thinking about the situations where these things are going to be used, which is the more interesting part to me. So basically, the trinkets are very similar in that they function by just giving you extra healing, right? That's their whole point. There's nothing else about them. How the Hero Charm does it is you start you at 408 healing, and then every time you cast a healing spell, you minus 34 now. Obviously, there's much quicker ways to do this, but we just put it out in very simple, plain, painstakingly easy terms here that you could see. 408, 374, right? We just broke it. We listed all the numbers out so you could clearly see exactly how it ramps down, and it basically just goes to 0. And then the beads, they are 190 healing, and they just maintain that for the entire 20-second duration. So all we did is we assumed, let's say, a flash heal, and I'm not going to break this down for every use case, right? The values are going to differ a little bit depending on which spell you use. If you use greater heal, right, then the ZHC kind of gets even better, because not only does it scale better with the higher values, but you don't get as many of the lower values, right, because you're not getting to cast as many spells. So obviously the higher cast time spells you use makes ZHC, Zandalari Hero Charm, even more effective. Things like Prayer of Healing, Greater Heal, or the normal heal even, stuff like that. But we did it with Flash Heal here because I want the comparison to be a little bit closer. I feel like this is going to be more akin to the standard use case. Basically, I'm thinking, you're in a tech pack situation, and people just start getting blasted by the techies, and you hit the trinket, and you just start blasting your Flash Heals out. And that's kind of what I was going for with this. So we did it for Flash Heal for both of these, and how you do that is it's 20 seconds total, right? So we divide it by 1.5 seconds, very easy. 13.3, obviously you can't have a portion of a cast here, so you round that down to 13. So you get 13 casts off with Flash Heal with either of these trinkets, because it's the same duration for both of them. Now, with the ZHC, as you can see here, if you actually count out each one of these, you'll realize that there's only 12 of these that actually have a positive value. So after this 34 here, you actually get 0 for the last cast. So you can technically cast 13 times with ZHC if you spammed Flash Heal after Flash Heal after Flash Heal. But the last one would basically net you 0 healing. Now, I'm not really sure if you can get all 13 out in terms of just like latency, even if you're spamming. You probably can. I'm not really entirely sure about that, but it's possible maybe that you can't. I haven't actually tested it in game. That would kind of throw the values off a little bit, but it'll be nothing major. It's not going to change the point that we're kind of getting at with this video. So we're assuming 13 casts. Remember, we don't get the last one for ZHC. Even if we did, though, it would be a very small amount, right? Even if we duplicated the 34, it wouldn't really add all that much onto that value. So, yeah, with ZHC, we get 2,652 healing, okay, and then we have 2,470 healing with the beads. So you get more raw healing, and then we also put them through the coefficient. So you see the numbers here after the coefficient, the 0.42 for Flash Heal. So you can see that you're basically just getting more juice out of the Hero Charm throughout the full duration. Now, the thing about this, though, is that you look at this and you'll be like, well, Hero Charm's better. And it is better, but it's better than you think it is. Because typically, when you're going to use this type of trinket, right, let's go back to the tech pack example that I just mentioned. We're talking about a situation where the damage is often very front-loaded. So you're reacting in a lot of cases to big bursts of damage coming out. I'm not really of the opinion that you should be constantly putting these trinkets on cooldown. What I mean by that is, you're not using it basically every time it comes up immediately. I think that tends to be just a waste. Even if you're getting like maybe 1 or 2 more uses out of the trinket, if you're popping it to heal 1 or 2 people in the duration that it, like in the 20-second duration, then you're just really not getting a lot of value if you're then missing a segment of the raid where you could have gotten the whole 20-second value out of it or close, right? So with that being said, I think using the trinket at the appropriate time is important, but even then, the damage is going to be front loaded. So like I said, it's going to be something where you see the damage come out, lots of techie damage, you're going to pop the trinket in response and start healing. And the idea is that as you stabilize the situation, you keep people alive, people aren't dying, right? So therefore more mobs are dying, more techies are dying. The situation becomes easier to manage as time ticks on during the pull. And if you were to like graph or plot the damage of the pull, it'd be huge spikes closer to the beginning, and then it would kind of gradually fall off into basically like no damage at the end, right? Now, the curve might be sharper, it might be more gradual, depending on how well the pull is executed, but that's going to be the general form in pretty much every pull, right? So that means that it's more valuable to have higher amounts of healing earlier on in the pull than later on, which is another advantage to the ZHC, right? Because you're getting the huge values, like you see, you're still quite comfortably above the beads for the first like 5 casts at least. Then it kind of gets close with these, and even in this range in the middle area, you're still basically in the same amount of plus healing as the beads. And then it's not really to the end where you really start to taper off, but by then the pull is probably mostly coming to its close anyway, right? So you're getting a lot of value out of here, because if you're not gaining anything on the tail end, then really the average starts to become more of these values, right? So instead of averaging this whole thing, you would really be more focused on like the first, maybe 6, 7 values, right? And that really starts to favor ZHC over the beats. So that's one way to look at it. And I think the other thing with ZHC is it just tends to be a lot easier to get, right? That's why I don't really tend to mention beads that much on this channel, just because it's kind of a pain. And realistically, if you don't get the beads when the warriors are all doing their Diamond Flask quest, it's going to be very difficult to find a group for Sunken Temple, because there's just not a lot of people right now that are leveling through the game, and there's not a lot of people that are really going to want to go into Sunken Temple and help you get your prayer beads. So unless you got them when the warriors are doing their quests, it's just kind of annoying to get them, and they're less effective ultimately than ZHC anyway, and ZHC should be really easy to get because it's a guaranteed drop from a car 2 times a week. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think there was something else I wanted to mention about these, but so yeah, you can use them concurrently, right? That's the other thing. So it doesn't hurt to have both. You can't use them at the same time, but you can use them one after the other. So that is a good argument for getting the beads, in the sense that you can swap them out. And I would say especially if you don't have a good trinket, like if you only have an unused trinket for one slot, let's say you have the DM, the Dire Maul trinket, right? Because everybody's going to have that. It's super easy to get, and it's a very good trinket. It's got the MP5, it's got the 30-some healing, really strong trinket. But let's say you don't have the trinket from Blackrock Depths, because nobody's running that anymore. You don't have the UBRS trinket, the other flat healing trinket from there, and you only have these types of trinkets, right? Then if you only had like 2 active trinkets, you had the heart and then you had the beads, it's obviously worth it to try and sub them out in order to get the effect from both of them, right? So I think it's like a 30-second cooldown. So you'll basically put a trinket on, you'll use it. Let's say you have it on to start the raid, right? So you'll use it, and then as soon as it ends, you'll swap it for the other trinket if you can get out of combat. That's going to incur a 30-second cooldown. Now, the trinket itself took 20 seconds to use, and then you might imagine some time kind of happens in between when the trinket use ends and when you can actually get out of combat to swap it. So let's add 10-15 seconds onto there to be safe, right? So we're at like 35 seconds. Then it takes another 30 seconds to swap the trinket. So, well, you can swap it instantly, but then it takes the new trinket 30 seconds before you can use it. So then after 30 seconds, you can then use the new trinket. That lasts for another 20 seconds. So now we're at kind of like, so imagine 35 seconds, then plus 30, then plus 20. So we're like a minute 25 at that point. Okay, and then you get out of combat, you swap the other trinket in. So really, I guess what I'm trying to say is having these two trinkets can be very strong if they're your only actives, right? Because by the time you actually get out of combat, you swap in the new trinket, you have the old trinket, you get out of combat, you swap the trinket, the 30-second timer is up, and then you use the new trinket, finish that one, you're out of combat, you can swap again, and then there's the 30-second allowance, right? You're basically kind of coming back to back, right? You're almost able to have one of these active every 2 minutes. But again, you're not going to need to have it active every 2 minutes because we're not trying to use them on cooldown all the time, right? Which means it's going to be even easier for you because you have a little bit of a buffer period there. You're not going to have to actually spam them every 2 minutes. And I think in a case like this, it is really worth doing the trinket cycling because odds are, as long as you're on top of it, you are going to have a pretty big healing buff up for every encounter, right? Now, where that starts to make less sense is if you have really good kind of like static trinkets, something like a rejuvenation gem or something like that. Because the problem is there's all the downtime, right, where you're not getting the just like the normal healing value out of your passive trinket because you would have to swap it out for something like that, right? Or if you have Dark Moon Card Blue in Rejuve Gem, now you have to swap out Dark Moon Card Blue. If Dark Moon Card Blue is in, you're not getting a bunch of chances now to proc the mana regen, which can be helpful. So the better static trinkets you have, the more annoying it is to do this. There's also the factor of sometimes when you start pulling really fast, like once you get into like a kind of like a decent level guild or pug, you hit this issue where between just the pull pace and things like blood rage and stuff like that can actually be difficult to get out of combat sometimes, especially at a particular time, right? So drinking isn't necessarily a huge problem because if you're persistent enough with spamming your key, right, you'll find a spot eventually to get out of combat and drink. And once you're out of combat, you can, the rest of the raid can be engaged in combat. You can just remain in your drink thing for the whole 20 seconds if you need to, and then rejoin the raid, right? The problem here is you kind of need that window to line up with the window that you want on swapping the trinkets. And when you're swapping two active trinkets, it's not really that bad, right? Because you weren't really gaining anything anyway because the other trinket is on cooldown. But when you're trying to swap a trinket with like a passive trinket, if you're not able to swap the trinket like immediately, basically after it gets used, and get the passive trinket back in there or whatever, you're starting to hemorrhage a lot of value on that other trinket. And then the other question you have to ask yourself is like, when you do get the active trinket back in there and you use it, how long is that sitting without being used? Because remember, we don't necessarily want to use it on cooldown, right? Because if we use it on cooldown, we might not really be getting much value from it at all, right? We could be using it in a part of the raid where we really don't need it at all. We don't need the extra healing. It would all just be overheal, or there'd be like a target that's just like a single target getting spammed, and you may not even get any healing value yourself on that target, let alone from the trinket, right? So there's kind of tricky situations like that, and you can play around it because you are going to know kind of when you're going to want to use the trinket for the most part, so you can kind of just make sure. So I would say, like, if you are swapping a trinket and you have a really strong static trinket like a rejuvenation gem, or it's really more of a case of if you have two strong static trinkets, right? Like a rejuvenation gem and a shard of scale, or a rejuvenation gem and a dark moon card blue. What I would be sure of is make sure that you're swapping in the secondary slot, and I would probably not swap the rejuvenation gem. I would probably always swap the shard or the dark moon card blue, and I would swap it for one of these in a scenario where big healing is coming out, right? And then I wouldn't, like, immediately after the trinket is done, I would swap to the static trinket, and I would only swap in the other trinket if you know another big healing check is coming up soon. And I guess what I'm saying is it's getting a little ranty now, but trying to imagine a situation where you have a rejuvenation gem and like a dark moon card blue and a shard of scale, and you're swapping the shard of scale dark moon card blue, right, for one of these active trinkets. It gets hard to imagine a situation where you're actually able to use both the beads and the ZHC on a consistent basis, right? Because I just think it's rare that you're going to need that burst of healing where it's going to line up perfectly at both times. You know what I mean? Because a lot of times how the raids tend to go is there's like a burst of healing required for this one portion, and it's kind of just like spot healing whatever for a decent other portion, and then you kind of maybe go back to needing that burst of healing. And in a lot of cases, the burst healing tends to come out on trash, right? So on bosses, stuff like this can be even harder to plan around. And on a boss, you tend to be in combat the entire time. And this is especially something to keep in mind going forward, is that the fights are starting to get a bit longer, right? So if you use something like a ZHC to open a fight, like Twin M's, then it's going to be on you for the whole fight. You're not trinket swapping that, right? So it's kind of something to keep in mind there. So I just think basically, like, if you already have one kind of really good mainstay trinket, right, then you're not really going to have to worry too much about swapping both of these in the alternate slot. So just something to keep in mind. You probably only need one of them. But if your trinkets are really bad, right, and you basically only have the blue Dire Maul trinket, right, and then you have maybe a really terrible trinket like the green shard from the Blasted Lands or something in your secondary slot, at that point, then go ahead and aggressively swap between the beads and the hero charm. Try and pick them both up. And this is kind of the same thing with the I know this is a beads versus EHC trinket, but this also applies to like the ZG trinket or the brooch that you'll get potentially in AQ40, right? So the worse your trinkets are, the more important it becomes to try and cycle these things. But the better your passive trinkets are, the more cost you're incurring, especially in a guild where it's hard to get out of combat. So just some thoughts on this stuff. And another thing that I think this kind of brings to mind is that I probably should have covered the beads a little bit earlier, because the beads actually are quite a good trinket. As you can see, they you basically get them, I think, an entire phase before, because they came out with the actual Blackwing layer right before ZG came out. So you get them a phase before the ZHC even comes out, and you don't have the ZG trinket at that point. You can't use that either. So they're really good for when they come out. Like, if you didn't have good trinkets and you only had the DM trinket and then you've got the prayer beads, that's a pretty good combination. It's basically like having a ZHC very early on, right? Obviously, it's not quite as good overall, and as we mentioned, you'd rather have the front-loaded effect of the ZHC in most cases, but still, it's very equivalent, as you can see here, when you consider that this is a trinket that you get guaranteed from a quest line that's relatively easy, especially if you do it right at the start when everybody else is doing it. So I think this video also just kind of goes to show the strength of the prayer beads, where even if it's not really competing against DHC super well, it wasn't really intended to, right? And, it still puts up a pretty good fight, even if ZHC is ultimately better. So yeah, that's basically the breakdown between the two trinkets, kind of like when you should use them, when you should think about using them. And yeah, like a lot of it is definitely situational. It depends on how fast your raid's going, what other gear you have. But thank you guys for watching, and yeah, hope to see you guys next time. See ya.